So we are running seminars monthly to our Cultural Safety Champions group. This group in our project is a mix of doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals who are interested in improving cultural safety. So for this group, we invite experts in these fields to come and speak to us about their work. And what we can learn from it to improve our practices and to help us reflect on ways we can work towards further embedding culturally safe care. Today, we've also extended this invite to staff at Menzies. So thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you will be able to take something away from today's presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Mayers. Dr. Mayers is a senior lecturer in philosophy at Deakin University and co-convenes the Philosophy and History of Ideas Research Group at Deakin. His research explores the political philosophy, bioethics, and the history and ethics of emerging technologies. He is the author of the Biopolitics of Lifestyle, Foucault Ethics and Healthy Choices, and Unsettling Food Politics, Agriculture, Dispossession, and Sovereignty in Australia. Dr. Mayers also co-hosts the podcast Undisciplinary, which explores the intersections of history, ethics, and health. The title for today's seminar is White Medicine, White Ethics, Looking Back to Look Forward. So thank you so much for being here today. Oh, and you can start your presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tiana, for the invitation to speak here. It is an honor, and I'll just try to get my slides shared. And it is also, I would say, somewhat more intimidating always speaking to doctors, healthcare professionals, and nurses, because you actually deal with people in in ways that talking about ideas does not always come into that direct interconnection between practice and what we do. Are you able to see those slides okay now?
Yep, we can
Great.
see them.
So I want to begin as well by acknowledging that I am on the lands of the Wadawurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to the elders who've cared for country here and the emerging leaders among the Wadawurrung peoples here, and also to extend my respects to any Aboriginal and First Nations people in the room or on the call today. So
select a speaker.
Sorry, if those online, if you could please mute yourselves.
Sorry, for some reason my slides aren't moving forward. Let's see what's going on here. Some reason it's not wanting to go into presenter mode. Look, I'll begin a little bit like this. Hopefully I can work it out on the fly. So yeah, just to start with, let me just work this out. I did watch the last presenter also had some troubles with their technology, even though they tested things out. Here we go. I think we're ready. So there we are. So just briefly about me, while I am living and working on the lands of the Wadawurrung peoples down here in Geelong in Victoria, I grew up in Perth in Western Australia, on the lands of the Noongar people. And my family came to Australia through the 10-pound POM scheme in the 1950s. And I teach justice and equality as one of the subjects I teach. And to my students, talking about history, and that's my interest as well, is philosophy and history and how the two intersect in shaping our social imaginary, shaping our context and our present, and the way that the history is not passed. And so in talking about my own family coming to Perth in 1951 from England, my grandfather was welcomed into, say, trade unions, the medical establishment and the churches, Church of England. Everything was set up for them to instantly belong at a time when non-European migrants were not welcome. And this map here is a map of Perth. My family were in and around Victoria Park, and that is within those red areas, which was a time when Aboriginal people were not allowed to enter into those areas up until 1954, after both my parents had been born. And so this is not, I guess, as many of you would no doubt appreciate, not distant past, but histories that shape the present and how we live and engage with the present and the opportunities that we have. So as mentioned, I think some of what I'll be talking about today comes from an article that I published a couple of years ago now called White Medicine, White Ethics on the Historical Formation of Racism in Australian Healthcare. But I'm also working on a book at the moment about the history of bioethics in Australia. And in that book, I have a chapter called, at the moment it's called Black Voices, White Noise, that traces how medical ethics in particular and bioethics have silenced or ignored Indigenous voices in the 1980s, primarily is the period that I'm looking at, developing a lot of research ethics protocols. So my focus today is going to be more on the whiteness of medical ethics. And this is partly due to, I suspect, that many of you are well aware of racism in medicine and the healthcare system, and you don't need me necessarily to tell you about that. But the other reason I think that I want to focus on ethics is that ethics is, in a sense, sort of my house. I'm a philosopher, and that I need to be part of the process in understanding the history of ethics and part of that process of, in a sense, getting the house in order. So, as you know, I suspect some of you may be aware or remember, or maybe you're trying not to remember, this controversy in Australia a few years back. In 2018, the Nurses and Midwifery Board of Australia updated its code of conduct, and they introduced concepts like cultural safety and white privilege. And then this led to commentators, unfortunately, predictably, people like Andrew Bolt, called it a new form of racism against white people, and Senator Cory Bernardi called it medical Marxism. And since 2018, I should say, almost all major medical societies have issued policies and position statements similar to that one in 2018 about racism, and have developed various training modules to address racism within their societies and within their medical practices. Yet, as we are all well familiar, racism remains both within society and also within medical and healthcare societies. So this question about, institutional racism essentially was an initial impetus for me to examine these historical roots and the ongoing impact of racism within Australian healthcare. But I wanted to move beyond individual attitudes, important as individual attitudes are, and look at the deeply ingrained institutional structures. So this could be the difference between what we might term, subjective racism, so being a racist individual, or systemic or structural racism, where even as an individual we may or may not hold racist views, but we are part of a structure or a system that is racially shaped, racially biased, many different terms we can use for that. And I wanted to consider how whiteness, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, even though, again, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this language. I wanted to examine how whiteness became this unspoken norm in medicine, and in particular in bioethics, and how that profoundly affects health outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in particular. But also I want to and today we'll, hopefully point some ways forward. So health and life expectancy gaps between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and the general non-Indigenous population. It's well known and well documented, those gaps. And these statistics point towards deeply embedded systemic issues, not just, as you know, isolated incidences or prejudices. But in this talk, I guess I want to start by unpacking two key terms that I'll be using: institutional racism and whiteness. So when we talk about institutional racism and whiteness in this specific healthcare context, what exactly are we, or what exactly am I talking about? Oops, gone backwards. So let's start with institutional racism. There are a variety of definitions. Judith Dwyer and her colleagues define it as racism that is encoded in the policies and funding regimes, the healthcare practices and prejudices that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's access to good care differentially. So the key thing is that it's not about one person being a racist. It's about the whole system is structured, often without conscious intent, to create these disadvantages. So racism is baked into the system, essentially. Oops. So whiteness is also a complex concept and phenomenon, and it comes from, an emerging area. Whiteness studies is a field of scholarship, and it's a critical concept, and it's not about, as it might seem, it's not just about skin color. So Debbie Bargali explains it as a system of power relations that provides non-Indigenous peoples, that privileges, non-Indigenous peoples over Indigenous Australian peoples. So think of it like as a invisible default setting, or the water in which we swim, or the air we breathe. I guess we don't swim in water as such, but using the goldfish analogy, it's trying to describe the water to a goldfish. So it's this invisible default. It constantly reinforces the power of white identifications and white interests, and it disguises this as the natural, normal order of things, or the better way of being in the world. So it's the standard against which others are measured. It's the subtle, pervasive way one group's norms just become the standard, often without anyone questioning it. So, and sometimes I give lectures to medical students, and I'm not sure if this has changed, but often when I go to a doctor's office or in some kind of medical, and there'll be a chart, often the chart will be of usually a male, and usually some kind of Caucasian male anatomy chart, for instance. And maybe some of these things are changing, but often the sort of just the norm of what kind of body would we present as the normal body on which to sort of map the anatomy will be the white male body. So it's this standard against which others are mentioned, and it's this subtle but pervasive way one group's norms just become the standard. And we can contrast whiteness with this idea of I don't see race. And this is really what whiteness studies and through this concept of whiteness are trying to do. They're trying to, in a sense, make conspicuous or make visible whiteness as a race. So other groups are racially othered, but the white remains the norm. So whiteness is trying to make conspicuous or visible the racial privileges of whiteness and white people, and how it operates, even if people think they don't see race, to use that trope. So this idea of not seeing race is quite problematic. Eileen Morton Robinson says it functions discursively to hide the power imbalances between those who are marked by race and those who do the marking. So when you claim you don't see race, you can inadvertently become blind to its very real effects on people's lives and healthcare. But it also happens through education and in a whole range of other institutions. So we miss the power dynamics if we say we don't see race. So some critical philosophers of race, so Charles Mills, who I'll be talking about in a moment, and Kamisha Russell, they'd say that explaining race as a socio-political reality. So rather than saying, I don't see race, race doesn't exist, race isn't a biological reality, therefore we shouldn't talk about it. They say, yes, they agree that race is not a biological reality that is meaningful, There's no gene for race, if you like, but it's absolutely real in its effects on society. And so Kamisha Russell uses the analogy of money. So money is a social construct. It's just an agreement that we have that these pieces of plastic or these exchanges through our bank accounts have a certain meaning to them, but its effects are undeniable. And you can't just opt out of, well, money, I don't see money, or money makes no sense to me. But it does have this reality, and it also passes on privilege through generations. So what Kamisha Russell and others argue is that anti-racist politics isn't trying to pretend that race doesn't exist socially. It's trying to highlight the constructed reality of whiteness and the actual tangible privilege it carries within our system. So whiteness is connected to the foundations, and this is, I'm going to go now to talk about the foundations of liberal political thought, which ties in with the foundations of liberal ethical thought. So whiteness has structured our social, moral, and political reality. And this is an idea that Charles Mills, a Jamaican American philosopher, talks about as racial liberalism. So Mills says that, sexism and racism aren't just unfortunate hiccups or flaws in an otherwise fair societies. So Mills draws a lot on feminist scholarship that pointed out the way that society is gendered. Women didn't have the vote, these sorts of things, and a liberal defending history might say, oh, well, that was an unfortunate hiccup in the history of liberalism, that it was unfortunate that women were denied the vote. Slavery was unfortunate. Liberalism's role in colonialism was unfortunate, but these were just hiccups rather than these were actually structurally shaped by these very ideas. So Mills argues, and unfortunately, I'm going to be talking about John Stuart Mill soon as well. We're going to have a few Mills clashing, so I'll try to be specific about which ones I'm talking about. But Charles Mills, the philosopher, says that sexism and racism aren't just unfortunate hiccups or flaws in an otherwise fair system, but they are embedded in the constitution of liberal societies themselves. They are part of the blueprint, the part of the constitution, literally and metaphorically. They shape what he calls the social ontology, or, it's a philosophical term we could think about as the social reality, the furniture, what is real in our society. So basically our shared understanding of reality, where the male white subject implicitly becomes the norm, the default standard, the default human, the reference point, if you like. And so this ties into another idea that Charles Mills developed and others, Linda Martin Elkoff, talked about as white epistemologies of ignorance. So epistemology of ignorance, it might sound counterintuitive because epistemology is about knowing and ignorance is about not knowing. But an epistemology of ignorance, you can think of it as a learned way of actively not knowing something. And I guess a sort of prime example in Australia of an example of epistemology of ignorance would be terra nullius, the founding myth of this nation, that this ignorance about not knowing that there were people here. So Elkoff describes epistemologies of ignorance as practices designed to protect the white population's belief that society is basically a meritocracy. People of color are responsible for their troubles, and racism is just a thing of the past. So the epistemology of ignorance, that's part of the whole idea of these things happened in the past. They were unfortunate, but that was just a blip rather than that was the order of things. So by isolating racism, so treating it like it's some ancient history, it protects and creates this comforting idea that society is fundamentally fair, especially for those who benefit from the current setup or the current arrangement. And as somebody who is at Deakin University, this cartoon here and the ongoing debate over Alfred Deakin and his role in the Constitution and white Australia policy is quite important and telling. This idea as controlling history, controlling what we know, becomes then an excuse for the present. So this white epistemologies of ignorance maintains the status quo by ignoring the uncomfortable realities of the past and their continued legacies in the present. So Charles Mills points out that the big names of liberal moral and political philosophy, so these are people like John Locke, Immanuel Kant, Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, they all developed their ideas of morality and an ethical society from a position where the white male was the unspoken default political subject. Their ideas were built on that foundation, often without explicitly acknowledging it. So I want to talk about Australia. Obviously, you know, that's part of the focus here. And say, well, how do these liberal political philosophers, what do they have to do with Australia? How did these concepts of whiteness, racial liberalism shape Australia's own institutions, particularly medicine and government? So colonial medicine and British utilitarian political liberalism, so British utilitarian political liberalism, John Stuart Mill being a key figure, Jeremy Bentham before him, but then also influenced a lot of colonial figures. So Edmund Wakefield, one example, and then the image here of Alfred Deakin being another. They were these were at the height, I guess, of their influence at the time that federation was occurring and the prior setting up of colonies, you know, such that South Australia was seen as a utilitarian colony, and some people refer to Australian society as a Benthamite society. So especially these ideas from Bentham and Mill, John Stuart Mill, were instrumental in making whiteness as the norm here. So a key figure in linking John Stuart Mill to Australian policy is Alfred Deakin, the second Prime Minister and the chief architect of the White Australia policy, which lasted as a policy from 1901 to 1973. And then, you know, depending on your view of history, some would say continues to very much have strong effects throughout our society, even though the legislation itself might have been changed through the introduction of the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975. So Deakin was heavily influenced by John Stuart Mill's idea that social homogeneity, so we can also think about maybe social coherence today, but social homogeneity of having everyone similar was necessary for political stability and free institutions. So here we see a quote from Alfred Deakin in 1901 talking about the unity of Australia is nothing if that does not imply a united race. A united race means a people possessing the same general cast of character and tone of thought. So the same way of thinking, really. And here is a quote from John Stuart Mill's Considerations of Representative Government, written in 1861. It says, free institutions are next to impossible in a country made up of different nationalities, among a people without fellow feeling, especially if they read and speak different languages, the united public opinion necessary to the working of representative government cannot exist. So this idea of having a homogenous people, one language, one race, was coming from Mill and very much influenced on Deakin, and no doubt you can hear reverberations of that and echoes of that today. So some people might want to say, well, this is all blatantly racist, and so biographers of Alfred Deakin, for instance, Judith Brett, she would say that he was a man of his times, that these things were unfortunate, but you know, we need to really actually focus on the good things about Alfred Deakin. You know, I think he introduced the weekend, I think the 8-hour working day, women's suffrage, these sorts of things. You know, we should focus on that part of his liberal political philosophy and just see this other stuff about White Australia policy as an unfortunate blip. But Charles Mills would say that we can't do that, that we need to see that these two things are entwined. So it wasn't despite his liberalism, but arguably because of certain interpretations of it, that he produced this idea of a united white race as the basis of Australia. And you might be wondering, this is all very interesting political history, Chris, but what's this got to do with medicine? Well, medicine had a key role in the White Australia policy. So Warwick Anderson's research is very valuable here. He shows that medicine wasn't just a bystander to what was going on and with these debates, but it actively participated in building the white nation. So back in the 1880s, there was anxiety among Europeans about tropical climates. Could white people survive and work and thrive in tropical environments? And there was this associated view that Indigenous people in tropical environments were reservoirs of diseases that could weaken and degenerate white settlers. So settling the North was seen as a biological challenge and a medical challenge. Could a working white race establish itself in perilous North Queensland? And answering that became a scientific project tied directly to justifying the White Australia policy. So this led to the founding of the Australian Institute of Tropical Medicine in Townsville, which has now become James Cook University in 1909. Its first director, Dr. Anton Burrell, was explicitly told his job was to determine whether the White Australia policy could make sense scientifically. And politicians like Sir William McGregor, the governor of Queensland at the time, called it one of the greatest problems of modern statesmanship. And Richard Berry, an anatomist from the University of Melbourne, also a well-known eugenicist, said that the White Australia policy wasn't really a policy. In reality, it's a medical problem of the first magnitude. So medicine provided the justification for racial liberalism. It helped sustain the reality where white bodies were the norm, the central concern, and even ideals like equality were openly and unashamedly racially coded. So I'm going to sort of move closer to our current time, but I'm like Chelsea Watego and others, I contend that this history is so formative and the foundation that makes it clear why something like the Racial Discrimination Act in 1975, while important, couldn't just magically fix everything. Or similarly, by introducing new codes of conduct, again, while very important, can't just magically fix things when so much of our social reality has been shaped by these ideas. So Chelsea Watego has argued that race was the foundation and it continues to structure our society, and we can't just patch over it. So how does this historical baggage play out today in Australian healthcare? Now, again, I'm not going to go into this in detail. I do talk about it in the article if you'd like to look that up. But I will just say that, and also I did watch the talk, the last one of these in the series, and they talked at detail about it. And I know some of the work that you all do goes into these details. So again, I won't spend much time on it, but we can see contemporary impacts in clinical care, funding and research agendas. So there are some interesting and important articles that look at the history of the NHNMRC and what they have funded in terms of research and when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health actually became a concern. Wasn't until the sort of 1960s, 1970s, concern for them and for the health of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Prior to that, it was more a concern about how infectious diseases could impact on white populations. And then also racism among healthcare professionals and the idea of medical spaces as white spaces. And if you haven't read Eileen Morton Robinson's work, in this book, The White Possessive, she has a very important chapter called Lisa's Story, which is about a racial discrimination case that Eileen Morton Robinson was an expert witness on, which was to do with a nurse called Lisa and a racial discrimination case and her experience of being a Aboriginal woman in a hospital. And yeah, I'd encourage you to read that if you are so inclined. So what I do want to talk about, though, in the time that remains is focus on how this history has shaped a lot of medical ethics and bioethics. I'll use these terms interchangeably. So medical ethics, yeah, being the sort of way, the norms that we shape how we do medical practice, what we see as good medical practice. And I want to see how this history has shaped the ideas of what we think of as good medical practice. And this means that medical ethics, I'm arguing, is that medical ethics and bioethics, because it has been shaped so much by this history, it can't shine an ethical light on this past and its present day effects, or it hasn't, at least to this point. That medical ethics and bioethics has been so bound or shaped by this history and these institutions that it has neglected its task in calling attention to these areas. So bioethicists have certainly tackled many important medical controversies over the years, abortion, reproductive healthcare, reproductive technologies, euthanasia, all of these sorts of things. But I argue that it has largely failed when it comes to adequately addressing addressing institutional racism and Indigenous health. And so the question is, why has there been this failure? Well, for one thing, bioethical solutions tend to focus purely on individual virtues like compassion or empathy, or individual principles like autonomy, which some scholars sort of suggest is a skewed view. But on the whole, that I would say does characterize a lot of bioethics, focusing on these individual virtues, either of the doctor or individual duties like beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and the like. And so one solution that has come up through bioethicists in relation to Indigenous health has been more compassion is needed. But more compassion is inadequate because they don't get to these historical constructions behind these biases. So again, in Warwick Anderson's look at colonial medicine, he talks about compassion and how compassion was often refracted or looked at through race. So 19th century experts and medical researchers, they may have felt compassion for Aboriginal people while still promoting racist science about them. So compassion isn't enough if the underlying structure is unjust. So bioethical responses have also been inadequate because bioethics itself is implicated in the whiteness of medicine. And this is for two main reasons. First, it's very closely tied to medicine and biotechnology. So some historians and sociologists of bioethics have described bioethics as being inside the belly of the whale being medicine and healthcare. And so trying to critique from within inside the whale has been hard to get that sort of necessary perspective. And I'd say, while there is some truth to that, I'd say that the bigger problem is that bioethics and medical ethics is deeply rooted in the liberal tradition that I've been talking about. So that racial liberalism is very much shaped bioethics. So the liberal tradition of political and moral philosophy is what most modern bioethicists will draw on. They'll draw on people like Immanuel Kant, on John Stuart Mill, on Jeremy Bentham for their ethical thinking. And so this often leads bioethicists to have sometimes a dogmatic adherence to something like individual autonomy as the most important value. Angus Dawson, for instance, a bioethicist, has critiqued bioethics for this dogmatic allegiance to individual autonomy because it undermines attention to these broader socio-political issues like systemic racism, because they get pushed to the side and they're not seen as a core issue. So if liberalism tends to be ignorant of its own whiteness, as Charles Mills, Kamisha Russell and others argue, then bioethics, as a child of liberalism, inherits much of this same ignorance. And I'm going to go through a couple of examples now, which hopefully will resonate and not get me into trouble. So one example is of, I guess, what I'd call white ethical ignorance, is in 2019, there was a process, and I'm not really wanting to comment on that process, of returning blood vials to people in Elcho Island. And from my understanding, that was an important and community empowering process. But in the context of that, Professor Simon Eastle, the director of the centre, ANU's National Centre of Indigenous Genomics, said something that I thought is an example really of this white ethical ignorance. So in the context of the return of these blood samples that were taken from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, Simon Eastill said, it would be wrong to call it wrong. When people did it, they did not know what they were doing might be unacceptable now. Okay, so he's saying that in 2019. The program that he's referring to, from my understanding, and the article and what he's talked about, started in 1968. So that's when they started taking these blood samples, 1968. What I have here, and I'm not expecting you to read this small text, but this is a screenshot of the Medical Journal of Australia issue from 1966, reporting on the National Health and Medical Research Council's statement on human experimentation from 1965, in which it explicitly talks about, throughout, but I've highlighted number 7, the subject of his, sorry, there is that gendered bias, but the subject or his legal guardian should have given the free consent after comprehending the nature of the study before research is undertaken. To this end, the investigator is responsible for providing the subject or his guardian at his level of comprehension with sufficient information about the purpose, methods, demands, risks, inconvenience, and discomforts of the study. So in 1965 and leading up to it, there were discussions within the Australian medical community about the importance of informed consent. And this was not the only article between 1966 and 1968 when these samples were being taken. But, so I guess the point being here is that they did know. Maybe these individuals didn't know, who knows? We can't go back and interview them. But the point being that there was a conversation and policies being written at the time, I should say, not even at the time, but before this time, to say that this was wrong. But I would suggest that this is part of this white ignorance that wants to excuse institutions and their predecessors for any moral wrong. And this issue of informed consent and when it's applied to non-Indigenous populations, as opposed to when it's applied to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, is something that reverberates. So informed consent for who is something we could ask. So in 1985, moving a decade or so ahead, the National Health and Medical Research Council ran a series of workshops around the country talking about medical research ethics committees, who should sit on them, what should be the nature of them, what's their scope. And here is a sort of report on the constitution and functions of institutional ethics committees. To my knowledge, and in looking through this, there is no mention of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander health or Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander representatives on ethics committees. And so a year later, I think this sort of, again, white ignorance comes out to play when the director of the NHNMRC, Richard Lovell, is questioned about the neglect of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interests. So in November 1986, the NHNMRC convened a national workshop in Alice Springs on the theme, research priorities to improve Aboriginal health. To this point, aside from activists and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples themselves, there had been little interest in Indigenous health from medical societies or research bodies. And during the workshop, Richard Lovell, the chairman of the NHNMRC, responded to complaints about the lack of attention to Indigenous ethics by pointing to the clauses of consent already in the National Statement of Human Experiment. And he suggested that these would be sufficient for dealing with research on Aboriginal peoples. So there was a workshop held in 1986 in Alice Springs. Participants in that called out Lovell and the statement for saying that there were no provisions in these statements for Indigenous ethics. And Lovell's response was saying, oh, no, we do. We've got this one here. Like this is what he pointed to, this number 7. No, we've got this thing about informed consent, and that applies to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as well. But the Aboriginal participants in the workshop responded to Lovell saying that the ethical standards of informed consent were not used when research was conducted on Aboriginal peoples and their communities, and that histories of unethical experimentation had created distrust of medical scientists among communities. Furthermore, they argued that Aboriginal people needed to be involved in developing specific guidelines for ethical research with Aboriginal communities. And this initiated a series of workshops led by Shane Houston and Ted Wilkes, which developed these ethical protocols and Aboriginal ethics committees. Now, the second example that I'm just going to bring up and continuing this theme, I was unaware this person had a connection to Menzies School of Health Research, but Barbara Flick, even when these protocols were developed, so this is now sort of 10 years after that, so jumping forward another decade. So even after these protocols were developed, professional bioethicists were relatively silent on this debate. So Aboriginal health, racism, and colonialism were largely absent from medical ethics journals and conference presentations between 1980s to 2000s. One of the few times Aboriginal ethics or health was discussed was at the third conference of the Australian Bioethics Association in 1994. And Barbara Flick recounted the violations done towards Aboriginal people in the name of medical science. And she argued that these abuses were not in the past, but were continuing today, and that Aboriginal people needed to have control over the research involving them, and they needed more input into the ethical ideas that were used. So in particular, Flick proposed that Aboriginal communities needed to have control of the kinds of research done and the kinds of ethical principles used. And I think this is an important point that hasn't been fully developed yet, this idea of whose ethics are actually being used. And in terms of control, having this power of veto seemed to be an important idea. Now, as far as I can tell from within the various journals and conference archives, Flick's calls for action was met with scholarly silence from the bioethics community and the medical ethics community. So what kind of path forward can we think about? So what needs to happen within medical ethics itself? How does it overcome this ignorance and this silence? So scholars like Professor Gail Garvey in Australia and Kamisha Russell in the US have argued for a fundamental shift within medical ethics in relation to race. So to move the experiences of people of colour, to those who have been racialised and marginalised, to move those experiences from the margins to the centre within bioethics. And this means changing the focus, moving from rights or the individual concerns to a more collective sense of justice, from consent to collaboration, from competence to humility. Now, this idea from moving from competence to humility suggests a need for non-Indigenous bioethicists to approach these issues with less certainty and more willingness to listen from those in more what have been to, quote unquote, marginalized experiences. But it's more than just inclusion. It's about a reconstitution of the social ontology or a reconstitution of the social reality that bioethics works within. That holds whiteness as the norm. It means dismantling the unspoken white-centric worldview, or, to use the, I think, more accurate but sometimes more off-putting idea of white supremacy. So it needs to dismantle the unspoken white-centric worldview that has shaped the field and making genuine space for different experiences of the world, but also different ethical frameworks and priorities. So a fundamental reshaping. And just two key concepts that I want to talk about in closing around this, one being sovereignty and the other justice. So Flick's arguments for power of veto and real control in the early 1980s are echoed in people like Gregory Phillips' calls for new terms of reference in Indigenous health, which centre Indigenous sovereignty, not just aiming for inclusion and equity within the existing system, because they can be subtly keep the old power structures in place. So it's not just about inclusion, but fundamental change. Rather, Indigenous intellectual sovereignty, as defined by Lester Rigney, means Indigenous people's own experiences, interests, knowledges must be at the centre of research methodologies and the construction of knowledge, and I would say the construction of ethical and moral knowledge, thus fundamentally shifting control. Indigenous priorities, Indigenous methods, Indigenous interpretations driving the research about Indigenous people. So Rigney argues that control over knowledge production is vital for the possibility of a non-neo-colonial future. So moving beyond just asking for fairness within the current system towards Indigenous communities, having control over their own health narratives, solutions, and the framing of what counts as ethical. So Chelsea Watego argues that centering Indigenous sovereignty will demand a relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia that is premised upon justice instead of benevolence. So benevolence can just be at the whim of who happens to be, in charge at the moment, whereas justice is about reframing and reshaping the rules of the game, so to speak. But this brings up this second question of justice. And this photo here is, I was fortunate enough to be able to participate in the Uruk Justice Commission's walk that Travis Lovett led, one of the commissioners from the Uruk Justice Commission from Portland in Victoria through to delivering the Commission's findings up at Victorian Parliament in Melbourne. I was able to go on the brief Geelong leg of that walk. But part of this, I think, is also a demonstration of us needing to think about justice in different ways. So Lewis Gordon, a philosopher, an Afrikaner US philosopher, asks if the norms of justice were the problem to begin with, simply expanding their membership may be the perpetuation of their damage. So Lewis Gordon argues that maybe we need to actually rethink what do we actually mean by justice and whose ideas of justice are we privileging? Because if we're just privileging John Locke and Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill's ideas of justice, then are we just going to be perpetuating these problems? Do we need to rethink our lexicon, our concepts, our tools? So Irene Watson asks, can we speak of justice that is justice from a Black or Aboriginal perspective, one that lives beyond the assimilation of the native? And I think just in sort of two recent I guess, big public pedagogical examples of this, introducing Indigenous words and concepts to help us rethink what does justice mean? What does truth mean? So Yurok is the Wemba word for truth, or through the Uluru Statement, the introduction into sort of the Australian mindset of Makarata, the Yulungu word for, among other things, coming together after a struggle, I think are ways that we can start to maybe rethink what do we mean by ethics, what do we mean by justice, and how could that shape our research governance and our medical practice. So I guess just in conclusion, I'd generally just be saying that understanding history of whiteness and racism in the formation of medicine and ethics should change how we see the current health disparities, as well as the ways that we seek to address them. So thank you very much. I'm happy to have any questions or correspondence if you did want to send me an email. There are also some things that I referenced. I'm happy to share these slides with you as well, if you would like.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chris, for coming in. Can we please get a round of applause? This was an extremely valuable presentation. Yeah, so much to reflect upon, so much to think about. Now, did anyone in the room or in person have any questions that they wanted to ask? I can see I've got one here online in the chat. So we've got a question here that says, what forms of resistance by individuals or systems exist when attempts are made to decenter white individualist approaches in bioethics in favor of more First Nations or collectivist approaches? Are there specific groups navigating this well that you can point to?
Thank you for the question. It's a big one and a complicated one in the sense that I think it really depends on the specifics of the institution, if it's happening within an institutional context. So, for instance, I know that in the International Association of Bioethics, there is a working group that is part of that organization that is trying to introduce more decolonial approaches to bioethics, and so advocating for that within an institution like the IAB. Other examples are things like changing the different sorts of curriculum or the different kinds of texts that are considered bioethical, as well as reframing what's considered a bioethical issue, if you like. So bioethics for a long time has been, preoccupied with things that go zap and pow, robots, cloning, that sort of stuff, and to sort of be able to show that things like, you know, infant feeding and birthing on country and these sorts of things are bioethical issues that need to be given significant attention. But there is resistance. Like I probably I don't want to talk about them in this particular context, but whiteness, as Eileen Morton Robinson and others, is a possession and reluctantly gives up possession of institutions. So there are examples where people have suggested that it's time for others to hand over the reins of an institution, and people have felt quite strongly that they're doing the good work, and so haven't wanted to let go of relinquish those reins. So I think that's a difficult one, and again, a case-by-case situation.
Thank you for that. Is there any more questions? Now, hey, you sort of answered. Oh, we've got one. Yes, Vicky.
Well, I don't know if it's a question or if I'm just listening and reflecting. Thank you so much, Christopher. Really thought-provoking. And I suppose when we look at the history, we are reminded of such bad practices that we don't want to repeat, which is really so vitally important to recognise. So I really value that. I was just wanting to pick up a bit on, well, there was I've got a bunch of thoughts going in my head, but the one thing that you were just talking about of justice versus benevolence, and that Chelsea Watego comment of a healthcare system needs to be built on justice and not benevolence. And as a non-medical person who works in health communication, I often observe, I think that those two things, benevolence can be, people can think that they are being just, but it's actually benevolence. If that, and how do we unpack that, particularly as and I will call myself a white do-gooder in this space. How do we keep confronting ourselves with that, I suppose, is what I was just, and I'm not expecting a clear-cut answer. It's just a reflective answer maybe on how do we as white people stop manifesting the whiteness and being benevolent and see it more as a justice issue. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think maybe, I mean, I find it like ironic, well, irony is maybe just hypocritical is better. After doing a lot of talking to talk about the importance of listening. But I also think, I guess reflecting on one's sort of motives and positions, and then also I think just in terms of the justice benevolence thing of thinking about how systems are set up in ways that, okay, if this particular person wasn't here, who maybe is the benevolent white do-gooder, and someone else were to come in, how can we guarantee that that new person coming in isn't going to perpetuate the things that we don't want? What things are in place to address that.
That's a really great point. And that's definitely the harder bit to do, though, too, isn't it? To
Yeah.
change the system, as opposed to changing the individual behaviour, change the system, work towards changing the system. No, that's a very good point. Thank you. Thank you.
And then we've got another question online from Rez. I can see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, hi, Chris. Thanks so much. A great presentation. Not so much a question, but just a comment, I think, to the previous question about what examples of resistance are there. And I just felt compelled to add that the Routledge Institute, which is the country's first community-led research institute, does a lot of great work in this space in changing the narrative and also creating really good resources for researchers. So I just wanted to add that, but really great presentation. And yes, I agree, would really like to see a shift in the research from a paradigm of Indigenous people needing help to Indigenous people being sovereignty and having the solutions themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, the Routledge Institute, that's another one that I recommend to the medical students when I give, the annual non-compulsory lecture on medical ethics and racism. There are resources out there that if they were able to read and were encouraged to engage with them, tell a much more convincing story than what I can.
Did we have any final questions before we wrap up, or any final reflections? All right.
Feel free to get in contact, send me an email. Love to hear what you're working on.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, great. Thank you so much. All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.